Welcome back. We are in module 7. So, today we will have the last lecture of module 7. In this lecture, we will discuss about the psychological and the neural aspect of second language acquisition. While doing that, we will also look at some theories. Psychological and neural aspects, we will basically look at how these theories, these positions or perspectives, what are their input with respect to second language acquisition. So, typically we have till now looked at the linguistic aspect and others. Now, we will have the other side of the story. So, psychologically, as in how the language acquisition is looked at from a mental perspective. When we talk about mental, we talk about not only the psychological, but also the neural. So, that is why we are looking at psychological and neural aspect of SLA. And some theories we will look at. As always, the theories I will be mentioning with very short, with very brief idea about those theories, because of paucity of time, and then we will move on. Lecture module 8 also will cover SLA. So, we will carry on the same kind of discussions there as well. So, to start with the psychological and neural aspect of second language acquisition, what do they deal with? Now, the moment we say psychological aspect, we are primarily looking at the processing stage, because mental processes are looked at from the perspective of some kind of a mechanism, some mental functioning that takes place in the mind. So, whatever we do, all kinds of mental functions are basically processes. That is how psychology looks at it. So, processes as in there is some amount of some kind of a dynamic interrelationship between the input and the output. So, you have the input and then there is some processes that happen and then you have an output. That kind of a structure is what we are primarily talking about. So, and when we are talking about the neural aspect, we are talking about the functional localization in the brain of the second language processes. That includes both the acquisition as well as use. So, these are the two things when that we will be primarily looking at. So, these I have listed here. So, functional localization of languages in the brain, by which we mean the localization of both the L1 and L2. Since we are talking about L2 SLA here, so how does learning a new language change, the tinker with the brain structure, because L1 is the first language to be acquired. So, it already has its brain areas kind of finalized, fixed, lateralized already. Then how does it differ from the L2? That is what we are primarily concerned with here. Then the processing of the two or more languages. So, not only the distinction between L1 and L2, but also all the successive languages, maybe L2, maybe L3, do they differ among themselves and so on. So, these are the areas. And then when whether first and second language or later languages are independent of each other or they are somewhat fused. So, these are domains that have been looked at over a few decades about as far as SLA is concerned. So, what are those domains? Primarily, what is the functional localization? Looking at it from neural perspective, what are the functional localization? How are they different from L1 and are they related to L1 and as well as related to each other, or are they separate? So, these are the topics that have been discussed and studied at length. The literature is very rich in this domain. Now, current understanding is that, because we will not be getting into all the nitty-gritties, the current understanding is that they are neither completely fused nor are they completely independent. So, there is a bit of mutual give and take, but also it is not entirely fused. There is some domain that are separate, some domains that are slightly different. We have discussed in another module about the possibility that language is actually made up of subsystems. Language is not a one single homogeneous system, it has subsystems. And we looked at it from the child language acquisition perspective, where we have discussed that some components of the language probably are more open to having interdependence, whereas other domains may be independent. So, that is where we stand today. Now, let us look at it a little bit more in detail. Now, we have already seen before that bilinguals can be divided into various groups depending on a number of factors. So, the first factor that we already discussed is about childhood bilingual versus adult bilingual. So, depending on when the second language is acquired, the human population can be divided into either childhood bilinguals or adult bilinguals. We have also seen within bilingualism, childhood bilingualism, we can have further distinction on in terms of even within that time frame, the early bilinguals are simultaneous bilinguals, late bilinguals are successive bilinguals. So, this part has already been taken care of. So, we will not talk about it again. So, these two things have been already discussed. So, simultaneous and successive and as well as childhood and adult we have already talked about. Now, let us look at the mental organization of the two languages. Now, this discussion is not exactly new, it goes really back in time all the way to the time of Osgood, when they talked about the compound, complex and compound, subordinate and coordinate bilinguals. So, the idea was the debate started with the question, how are the two languages stored in the human mind. At that time they were talking about mind. So, not in terms of brain. So, where in the mind, how what is the nature of organization of these two languages that bilinguals learn? Are they stored at the same place? Are they stored separately without any mutual give and take, or are they organized in a hierarchical manner? And if it hierarchical as in the L1, because it is already in place. So, are we using a mechanism where we access L2 via the L1. So, depending on these three possibilities, the bilinguals were divided into three groups: coordinate, compound and we have our subordinate. So, coordinate is the one where bilingual has two languages parallel to each other, they are independent. Compound is when they have two systems fused together. So, one storage and which can be accessed via different languages, and this is also, if you recall, we have already talked about the interdependent hypothesis and separate development hypothesis. So, this is where you have interdependent hypothesis which kind of corresponds to compound bilingualism, and then you have subordinate bilinguals where one language is accessed via the other. So, typically this is L2 and this will be L1. So, L2 will be accessed via L1 because L1 is already in place. This is something like learning the L2 via L1, which is very common in many at school level in many places, where you will show a particular item and trying to teach the name of that item in English language, and you will be using the mother tongue to make that connection. So, that kind of a thing. Now, these older divisions the previous distinctions can actually be can overlap with the later distinctions that we have already seen. For example, subordinate bilinguals will be more or less comparable with late bilinguals, because not always, but it can. So, if you are learning your second language later, then the chances of accessing L2 via L1 becomes higher. Similarly, you can also have there is also interaction between compound and early proficient bilinguals. So, if you are an early bilingual, you learnt your second language pretty early in life, then chances of you having a single sort of a storage system is much higher. So, this is where we have some parallel with compound bilingual. In fact, there is a whole literature on this as to how these these are not really fixed categories. For example, a very important theory in this domain of bilingual access about how the storage is takes place, how do we access the storage, conceptual storage. So, there are these two levels, we have conceptual storage and we have lexical domain. So, depending on your proficiency level, in the beginning a beginner learner, let us say, can access the conceptual storage via L2. As the proficiency goes higher, the L2 also has a direct access to the conceptual storage. So, based on this idea, a very influential theory called RHM was proposed, revised hierarchical model, So, but we are not going there, just giving an idea about how these categories are kind of fluid. As the person, as the bilingual learner gets higher proficient, more and more proficient, the equation changes. So, it is possible to go from subordinate to compound bilingualism in the same person. Now, these are why are we discussing these things? Because this is not only about the way the person speaks the L2, but also because there is a direct correlation with the neural structure with respect to the bilingual speaker. So, because of the brain behavior, in terms of brain behavior. So, this is where the neural part is more evident, where you see that bilingual language processing has a very distinct signature, neural signature, as opposed to L1 language processing in L1 processing. So, brain functions show subtle differences in language processing based on all of these variables, and then as I just said, all these variables are not very fixed kind of a variable, they can shift from here and there depending on various factors. For example, depending on age, let us say age range, around what time, it is not like fixed age 3 years you see one kind of neural signature, 4 years another, no, it is a range. So, if you are an early bilingual within this age range versus you are a late bilingual within this age range, do we see different kinds of neural signature? Yes. So, that is what the main point here is. So, depending on the age range when the second language is learned, it might engage different parts of the brain while processing. Similarly, level of proficiency also has very significant and interesting interaction with the different areas in the brain. We will not discuss it in great detail here, because this topic has been extensively discussed in another module. So, we will leave it for that module. Now, let us move on to the psychological theories of learning. Psychological theories, of course, there are a number of theories, but as far as SLA is concerned, we will only focus on 3: information processing theory, connectionism and complexity theory. Connectionism also we have discussed before, so we will briefly go over. So, let us start with information processing as a theory. Now, information processing theory primarily depends on these 3 components: input, central processing and output. So, what do we mean by input? And in psychological terms, input basically refers to the perception, any kind of perception. So, whether it is visual perception, auditory or whatever, tactile perception, depending on how your sensory organs are taking the input from the environment, that is what basically is the domain of perception. So, whatever you are taking in as an input, whatever is coming in to the system, that is the input, and then that input, remember our stimulus response behaviorism theory. So, input is part of this theory as well, but it is not a direct input to output kind of a mechanism. We also have something very important in the middle, which is our central processing. So, depending on the kind of input that you get, depending on the kind of central processing that is engaged and the interaction between these two, then we have a certain kind of output. So, it is a complex process rather than a direct input output stimulus response system. I am telling this because it might come to your mind that we have talked about input and output before, but here this is the crucial difference. Now, in terms of language, in terms of SLA, the input will be linguistic input. So, whatever you are seeing or hearing, seeing as in reading, let us say, a large number of linguistic input in today's world also comes to the visual channel. So, we read books or whatever different kinds of road signs, from road signs to books, everything, a lot of data actually comes into the visual channel, and also of course auditory. So, all of that input for SLA, whatever the child is exposed to or the adult learner is exposed to, that will be considered to be the input, because there is no filtering there, it is just there, you are in the middle of a linguistic environment. So, all of that qualifies to be called the input. Then comes the central processing. In terms of processing of in terms of language, we are talking about processing of linguistic components. Now, how do you process those information? That is where is the most important part, and that is what we will discuss also. And then output. Output can be, in psychological terms, it can be many things. Because we are talking about language here, so we will stick to language production. So, our production as in either speaking or writing. There are 2 ways of producing language, speaking or writing. So, this is the the structure. Now, mental functions can be understood in terms of information processing as we just saw. So, any mental function including language has these components. So, input level generally covers perception of different types, and then you have the processing where the main work happens at the central processing level. So, at the processing level what happens is that there are complex layers of interconnected mechanisms that are dealt with. Now, in terms of language, that complex interconnection will have to do with various not only language internal factors like various structural properties, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics and all that, but also there are many other factors. For example, the socio-cultural factor, the background, the person's psychological state and so on. So, all of that interacts with each other, and that is why processing level is the most important layer. So, when we learn anything, as per as this theory, when you learn anything, we break down the complex matters into simplified, let us say pockets of simple tasks. So, if we have to learn the stages of syntactic operations, probably we start with a simple operation first. How do we create a, how do we use auxiliary? Once we have figured out the use of auxiliary in English language, then it is easier for us to go to the next level of creating question sentences and like that. So, this is the idea in this theory. So, we start with simple task and gradually move up hierarchically to the more complex task. And as we go to more complex task, what basically happens as far as IP is concerned, we go from one kind of processing to another kind of processing. So, processing, when we say processing or the mechanism is not a again a one size fits all kind of a structure. There are two kinds of processing in human mind. They are called automatic processing and controlled processing. Automatic processing is largely involuntary or let us say subconscious, you do not really notice. For example, if you have been making tea every day morning, it becomes an automatic processing. You know where the the pan is, where the sugar is, where the tea is. So, you do not really look for the tea and look for the sugar, and then it becomes a pattern. That is what we call automatic processing. Similarly, a good driver does not really need to look at everything in the road. There are certain things that is already taken care of, that is already understood. So, anything that you have mastered over a period of time becomes an automatic processing. For example, for teachers like us, teaching becomes an automatic processing. We do not really, of course, we prepare the course material, but how to teach, how the nitty-gritties of delivering the lecture becomes an automatic thing. The other part of the processing is what we call controlled processing, which is voluntary, which is more voluntary as in where you have to consciously pay attention. So, allocating selective attention to the task at hand is a crucial part of control processing. So, whenever you do something new, let us say I start learning tennis tomorrow, I have no idea about how tennis is played apart from watching it on TV. So, the moment you are on the court, you need to know things, you cannot just, you are not anymore an observer, you are a player. So, you need to notice everything, the rule book maybe you have already read, now you have to notice how it actually plays out. So, that is what is a control processing. Any new task that you do requires control processing. So, whenever you learn a new language, it also needs control processing. So, the proficiency going from initial learner to high level learner, or let us say proficient learner, low proficient to high proficient learner is basically a journey from control processing to automatic processing. So, not only we are talking about processing that happens between input and output, but also within processing as a mechanism, we need to go from, or we do go from controlled, voluntary, attention intensive process to a more automatic sort of a process, and only when you have taken care of one part. So, the simple task, once you have mastered it, it goes on to the, you can move on to the next part. So, gradually through a hierarchical structure, you go from one structure to another and you automatize the whole process. So, that is the idea. This is already discussed. So, now let us come to the input, how input has been seen. In SLA, the input for the processing mechanism to work is anything that the learner is, any kind of language input, whatever kind of language input the learner is exposed to, that will qualify. then the learner needs to actively engage attention, because this is a new language for them. This is more of a voluntary thing. So, when they are learning, this is applicable only for SLA, by the way, not for simultaneous. So, they have to actively engage attention to certain parts of the input, and the basis for this priority, why priority? Because we need to prioritize what to learn first. Our brain works differently depending on who the person is. So, there is an interaction between the process and the person as well. But for now, let us stick to the input. So, when we have the input, what we do is we prioritize certain structures. Let us say I speak language L1 and I am now exposed to language L2, which are similar. So, what I will do is, what my mind will do is, I know that once you realize from the input through statistical learning, by looking at the pattern over a number of contexts, which something we have already discussed. So, once you have realized that certain things are common between my L1 and L2, then I do not need to give attention to that becomes automatically, it progresses to the automatic stage. Now, I will focus on certain aspects that are slightly similar, but slightly dissimilar as well. So, let us say 30-70 distinctions. So, I will focus on that. So, I will prioritize that aspect of language of my L2 to process, and once I have figured that out, I will go on the other one. So, there are theories as to how we prioritize. There are very many theories, but we will here we are following Skimm's theory, where they talk about frequency of encounter, then the perceptual saliency, instructional strategies, because often L2 is learnt in a tutored environment. So, the instructional strategy, individuals processing ability as well. So, not every learner is same, all humans are different with their capacities and their strategies of learning. So, that is also another factor. Readiness to notice particular items related to the hierarchy of complexity and task demand. So, these are the factors on the basis of which theories have been proposed as to how we prioritize the input. Then comes our processing, of course. So, language learning and use is layered process. We start with the components, simple components, gradually moving forward. So, basically going from control to automatic. Now, one important thing that is part of this theory is this IP theory of language acquisition is that there is a restructuring that happens. So, you initial input, you have created a kind of an abstraction of the language, and then as more and more input keeps coming, there is a restructuring of your internal grammar. That is very important in this theory. And this restructuring is not exactly linear. So, you do not make 1 and 1 2 like that, it is not a simple. So, this restructuring happens on multiple in a layered way. It is a complex kind of a structure. So, and that is why, how do we know this? This is most visible through the U-shaped form of learning. This is common in many kinds of learning, including this, including SLA. What does U-shaped learning basically say is that initial stages you seem to get the grammar correct. After some time you tend to go all wrong, you create wrong grammar, wrong production, and then again you come back to the proper grammar. So, that is called an U-shaped learning, and this is something that is taken as one of the proofs for the multidimensional sort of a restructuring that happens. So, this change takes place, and I quote, partially discontinuous plane along which there is a regular systemic reorganization and reformulation. So, first you get one kind of grammar, then a new kind of input comes in, and accordingly you restructure, reformulate. It takes a little bit of time, and eventually you get the entire grammar correct. That is the main idea. So, restructuring is a very important component. Output is also important within this theory, because why output is important? Output is something because when we have this vocal auditory loop based language, when we speak, it also becomes a kind of an input for us ourselves, not only for others but also for ourselves, because we hear ourselves speaking. So, when you hear yourself speaking, you notice the errors. That is an important thing about learning language. So, you notice the problems, the gaps, and then you eventually correct yourself. So, this gives you an opportunity to self correct. And then also you realize which are the relevant information where more attention is needed. Hence, output is not just the final product, but it is also input for your eventual correction, because this development is continuous, right. So, this is why output is also important. And by using output as a, ultimately we will use output only as a data, right, for any kind of experimental studies. And what do we see there? What we see is that L2 of fluent speakers has higher recall time in for both vocabulary and grammatical items as compared to L1. So, even if you are high proficient bilingual, your L2 proficiency is very high, even then your recall time is longer than your L1. Not only that, even with that, even within L2, proficiency becomes an indicator of the automaticity. So, it becomes, for L1 it becomes automatic, but for L2 to go to that automatic stage takes a really long time. And even after you have become very proficient, you might still not be able to match up to L1. However, there are reverse, there are other kinds of proof as well, because continuous use is another factor. So, reverse dominance is also another very interesting finding of recent times. What happens is, typically L1 will be stronger than L2, but what happens is, let us say you have changed place, you are not anymore staying in the place that you used to, you have moved out of your native place and in a L2 environment. Consequently, you do not use your L1 very frequently anymore. Then it is possible for your L2 to become dominant and L1 to become less dominant, in which case the result will be opposite. That is the case of reverse dominance. But anyway, that is another domain of bilingual processing. Now, psychological theory not only talks about how this learning happens, but also the order of the acquisition. Remember, we have talked about the order of acquisition throughout this course as to why do we see the order that we see. In case of SLA also, in case of acquiring second language also, this psychological theory gives a processing based understanding. What is the processing based understanding? Learners' acquisition of grammatical structures follow a developmental sequence, as we have already seen in other cases, but in this case the sequence reflect how learners overcome processing limitations. So, as you take care of one level of processing and you move on to the other, simultaneously you move on through the grammatical stages or the developmental stages of the L2. So, learning is dependent on mastering the processing operations. So, once you have mastered processing level 1, let us say as I said auxiliary, and that part is taken care of, you move on to the next stage. So, it is basically about mastering processing difficulties rather than based on any kind of an internal rule as proposed by universal grammar. And so, based on IP theory's notion of constraint on limited capacity. Why limited capacity? Because our control processing needs a lot of attention. So, attentional allocation is very high for control processing, as a result of which we cannot attend to a large number of things equally well at the same time. So, we need to optimize. Now, how do we optimize? This is how we optimize. We take care of one problem and then move on to the other. So, to code Klassen, for example, linguistic structures which require high degree of processing capacity will be acquired late. So, we optimize by taking care of the simple task first and then move on gradually to the higher level. And when we have reached the higher level also has smaller simpler components, right. So, in those simpler components, let us say it has 10 components, 5 have already been mastered. So, the rest 5 we now take care. So, basically development of SLA, development of second language knowledge is based on mastering those layers of processing that are required. And this capacity for these structures, for example, syntactic structures, depend on the extent to which their underlying relations are preserved in output. So, how much are you able to give output? And then he mentions a hierarchy. So, you go from canonical order strategy to initialization and then subordinate clause strategy and so on. So, basically in syntax, there is a pattern through which we go in terms of processing. Then another theory is of course that of connectionism, very important and very influential theory, and this approaches to learning have many similarities with IP theory, IP perspective, because the idea is that the entire learning mechanism is internal, is based on processing. but here the focus is slightly different. The focus is on the gradual increase in the strength of association between stimuli and response. So, this is based on different pathways that we create. So, dependent on what we are learning, we have different representation in the brain, and gradually through use those connections, those pathways become strengthened, and as a result of which we learn. So, these are there are nodes in the network, and the connection between them becomes stronger over a period of time, and that is how you learn. So, learning here in this theory is basically a change in the strength of these connections, not on restructuring. So, that is the difference between IP theory and connectionism, even though they share a lot of similarities. We have discussed this RMM model elsewhere in the course. So, again we are not going into detail here. RMM model as in Rumelert-Maclelland model. We have discussed it in connection with comparing it with the nativism and how they are similar and how they are different. Let us move on to complexity theory. Complexity theory is again part of a number of theories. They are called by different names: dynamic systems theory, complex systems theory, and chaos theory, and so on. This idea of this theory came from the natural sciences, and also is used for understanding second language acquisition. It was first used by Larsen Freeman. So, the fundamental idea of complexity theory is that languages are complex systems with interconnected components and stages of learner language. Interconnected component we have already seen before, that there are this phonological, morphological, various kinds of systems. So, this means that all of them while language development is happening, it is not like you take care of phonology first and then morphology, then even though the course is structured like that, we talked about phonology first and then morphology, but learning does not happen like that. Learning happens all of them in an interdependent way. So, the learner, whether child or an adult learner, has a lot of interaction between those or among those structures simultaneously. That is what this theory primarily says. So, these components become more and more structured and organized, and this structure does not arise out of any underlying grammar. So, this is the difference between complexity theory and the universal grammar. These regularities are not rule driven. There are no mechanisms for such top down governance. So, it is not because the eventual development is not dependent on the underlying grammar or universal grammar, but the connections between them, how they are, the dynamics between different levels of language, as well as the dynamics of those with the language use. So, when we use language in the real life, there are many other things that also come in. So, socio-cultural practices, the person himself, and so on. So, the salient features of this theory, because it differs from both linguistic and psychological accounts, the salient features primarily are the internal and external factors dynamics. So, the dynamism between the internal and the external factors. So, different kinds of effects of communicative functions, then the structural relationship between L1 and L2, intentions and acts of learners and others, and a host of other factors. So, this is what we mean by internal and external. Internal as in the learner internal, language internal, as well as the outside social influences. So, all of them work together in a very complex interaction, thereby we learn language. So, that is the complexity theory. Last but not the least is the learner variation. So, learners also differ, because we have just seen that complexity theory takes into account the learner variation. Many other theories also take into account that learner also plays a very important role. We have already seen the factor of age. So, when you talk about learner dependent or learner centric functions, age is an important factor that has already been taken care of. However, all of these other factors are equally important. So, the aptitude, not everybody is equally adept at learning new language, or even if they are, maybe somebody is good at learning the sound, somebody is a master in learning the grammar quickly, and so on. So, aptitude is a very, very important factor. Motivation, we have seen motivation, the ideas of motivation sporadically before as well. Cognitive style, personality, learning style, and so on and so forth. So, it is not only the age, not only the aptitude, these are not again independent of each other, not exclusive of each other. They can also, for example, if you are a young person learning a language, but your learning style is such that you take a lot of time to learn, then it will not work. On the other hand, a person who is much older, but has a cognitive style and learning style that is more conducive to learning language faster, then he will learn faster. So, there is a lot of interaction even within the learner oriented perspective as well. So, how do we arrive at these strategies? How do we know what are the strategies? Typically, we will use self-report technique. So, we will ask learners self-report, like what do you think, what did you do when you were facing problem? Let us say a lot of, in Indian context, the Hindi has grammatical gender. Many eastern languages do not have. So, Bengali does not have, Assamese does not have. So, this is a bottleneck for Bengali and Assamese learners of Hindi, that the grammar with respect to gender goes totally bonkers. So, question that we ask them will be, what is the problem that you faced? How are you tackling this problem? What is the strategy that we use? What do you think are the barriers for you to learn? So, that is what you call self-report, asking the learner to report what are the problems and how they strategized to overcome those problems, or could they not, if not why, and so on. Various kinds of questions can be asked as to how do they do this, that is one. So, they are asked to report the strategies, for example. Also, sometimes they are asked to keep a journal or record, even if you are not telling the experimenter, you can keep a journal or a record of various kinds of grammatical constructions or discourse strategies that the learner has used. For children, because for adults observation does not always help, but for children observation does, because adults can you do not really, they will not be able to fathom exactly what the learner is thinking or trying to do, but for children it is easier to use observation method, as a result of which for children observation method is often used, and they also use something very interesting which is called self-directed speech. Children talk to themselves. So, when they are learning the L2, there has been many reports, for example, by Savil Toigid in 1988, where they talk about how the child is narrating to himself or herself as to what is happening in the L2. Okay, this is how it is done, now I will use S to make a plural, something like this. Children talk to themselves. So, this is what another thing that has been recorded and studied. So, yet another technique is called playback technique. What happens in playback technique is the learner working on the L2 tasks, because many of the researchers use some kind of a task to arrive at the difficulty that the person is facing. So, while they are performing the task in their L2, those entire process will be recorded, and that record will be played back to them, and then they will be asked in their L1 what was happening. You play back the recording of the task, performance on the task, and then they will ask to narrate in L1 what kind of method did they use. So, see, you were doing this, you had a grammaticality judgment task in L2, and this is how you progressed. So, what exactly were you doing? Please tell us in your mother tongue, you tell us in your L1. So, that is another method. So, what are the methods? For children, it is easy to use observation. So, observation method is used for children. For children, again self-talk is also used. Similarly, there are these playback techniques, and for adults there is self-report that is more often utilized. So, these are the methods that we use in order to figure out what are the strategies that the learners are using, and in fact, these are used as input for language teaching methodologies as well across various kinds of pedagogical practices. To sum up in this module, what we have discussed is the neural and psychological aspects of second language acquisition. Neural aspect as in how learning a second language has direct correlation with the different kinds of neural signatures. We did not go into too much of detail because it has already been taken care of in another module. Then psychological theories of SLA like information processing theory, connectionism and complexity theory, and then psychological perspectives also takes into account the learner's perspective, which is very important because the learner is an active agent in the entire process. So, we looked at the strategies used by the learners and how do we know what are those strategies, that also has been discussed. So, this is where we wrap up module 7. Module 8 we will continue discussing second language acquisition, taking various other factors into consideration. Thank you.